130 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Jamal Hayes had no alibi, no defense, and no chance. The judge, the jury, the evidence, everything was stacked against him. But what no one knew was that Jamal wasn't just any man. He was about to turn the tables in a way no one could have ever expected. Jamal Hayes had lived a quiet life, an honest one. At 33 years old, he ran a small auto repair shop in the heart of the city, far from the drama and chaos that often defined his neighborhood. His past wasn't spotless, but he had turned a new leaf. He was no longer the troubled youth who'd made mistakes. Instead, he was a man trying to build a future for his family, working hard and living under the radar. That was until the world flipped upside down. The city he called home wasn't exactly known for its fair treatment of black men, and Jamal had always been careful to stay out of the way. But fate had a different plan for him. One cold evening, a local business mogul was found dead, brutally murdered in what seemed like a random robbery gone wrong. A witness had identified Jamal as the culprit, and just like that, his name was tied to the crime. What the world didn't know was that this wasn't just a random event. Jamal wasn't just another man caught in the web of a broken justice system. He was targeted. But why? The answer, though buried deep, was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The trial that followed was nothing short of a nightmare for Jamal. Judge Carter, a man known for his racist tendencies, had already made up his mind before the trial even began. A man who had once used his power to silence anyone who dared challenge the status quo. He was the embodiment of a broken system. And now, Jamal found himself at the mercy of this man, with no defense, no chance, and no one to turn to. As Jamal sat in that courtroom, his mind raced. What had happened to the justice he had been taught to believe in? He looked at the jury, mostly white, with no interest in the truth. They were just here to do their job, a job that would send a man to prison for life. The evidence was clear. There was none. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to suggest Jamal was the killer. But it didn't matter. The prosecutor didn't care, the judge didn't care, and the jury certainly didn't care. In their eyes, Jamal was guilty. The color of his skin was all the proof they needed. Yet, despite everything stacked against him, Jamal didn't show fear. There was no panic in his eyes, no desperation in his voice. He sat quietly, listening to the lies told about him. He knew something they didn't. His wife, Monica, sat beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. The man she married had been nothing but kind and hard-working. Yet here he was, a man with no future, condemned by a corrupt system. And their son, only 6 years old, had to witness his father's fate being sealed in front of him. As the trial continued, Jamal didn't speak much, his only response being a calm demeanor that didn't match the storm raging within him. The wheels of injustice were turning, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. But little did anyone know, Jamal was playing a much bigger game, a game no one could see coming. The question was, would anyone ever find out the truth before it was too late? The day of the verdict finally arrived. Jamal sat silently, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed straight ahead. His lawyer had done everything he could, but the system was never going to let him win. Judge Carter was too powerful, too connected, too deeply entrenched in his own version of the truth. It was a truth that painted Jamal as guilty before he even had a chance to speak. The jury had already made up their minds. There was no escape for him. As the courtroom filled with anxious whispers, the moment of reckoning came. The judge slowly stood, his gavel raised in his hand, casting a shadow over the room. The silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. Jamal felt his heartbeat in his throat. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of his life. Jamal Hayes, Judge Carter's voice echoed, cold and final. You have been found guilty of the murder of Michael Williams. I hereby sentence you to 130 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. Jamal's eyes never left the judge. His expression remained unchanged, but inside, a storm was brewing. The injustice of it all settled deep in his chest, but there was no room for anger, no room for fear. He had made his peace with the truth long ago. Monica gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she turned toward him. Jamal, no, she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her world was crashing down around her, but Jamal held her gaze for just a moment before looking forward again, his calm presence almost unnerving in the face of what was happening. The gavel slammed down. The room erupted in murmurs, some filled with sympathy for Jamal, others with satisfaction at the certainty of his fate. But Jamal wasn't thinking about the people around him. He was thinking about something far bigger, something much more dangerous. He knew, deep in his soul, that this wasn't just an ordinary trial. It was the culmination of a much darker game, one that had been set into motion long before he even knew he'd become its pawn. Judge Carter had no idea who he was dealing with. This was no ordinary man, sentenced today. Jamal wasn't just another statistic to be thrown away by the system. He wasn't going to let this happen, not without a fight. But even more important, he wasn't going to let Carter or anyone else think they could get away with this. As the guards moved to escort him out, Jamal stood up slowly, his hands cuffed in front of him. His eyes never wavered from Carter's as he took his first steps toward the door. He didn't speak a word, but his message was clear. The judge's smirk faded just a little, as if he felt the weight of something he didn't understand, something unseen. But he dismissed it, too caught up in the power he thought he had. Yet, in those final moments, as Jamal left the courtroom, there was a sense of something shifting, something starting to change. The game was far from over. The door closed behind him, but it wasn't just the door of the courtroom that had closed. It was the door on the old version of the man who had walked in. Jamal Hayes wasn't who they thought he was. He was something much more, and he was about to prove it. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as Jamal was let out. His hands were cuffed, his steps deliberate, his eyes locked on the floor ahead of him. Monica's sobs echoed in the background, but Jamal's mind was elsewhere. The guards shuffled him into a holding cell, where he was to wait for the final processing before being transferred to a maximum security prison. But Jamal was no ordinary prisoner. This wasn't the end of his story, not by a long shot. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Carter had already returned to his seat, his demeanor smug and self-assured, as if he'd already won. The case was closed in his mind. Jamal was guilty, the jury had spoken, and the evidence, fabricated or not, was enough to seal his fate. He felt no remorse. In his world, men like Jamal never got a second chance. They were disposable. But just as Carter prepared to call for a recess, the courtroom door burst open with a force that made everyone stop in their tracks. A group of FBI agents, some in plain clothes, others in tactical gear, stormed in, their presence sharp and commanding. The room fell into a stunned silence. One of the agents, a tall woman with piercing eyes, stepped forward, holding up a briefcase filled with documents. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice unwavering, "this trial is far from over." Carter's face darkened. What is this? Who are you people? His eyes flickered toward the door, as if he might summon security to throw them out. The agent didn't flinch. You're under investigation for corruption, obstruction of justice, and multiple cases of misconduct. She opened the briefcase and tossed a stack of papers onto the judge's desk. We have all the proof we need to take you down. Carter's heart skipped a beat. His smirk faltered for the briefest moment. But in that moment, he knew something had gone wrong. He knew he was no longer in control. His usual tactics of dismissing inconvenient truths, silencing those who threatened his power, suddenly felt weak. His voice was strained as he stood up, his eyes darting nervously to the agents. This is ridiculous. I am the judge here. I run this courtroom. What are you trying to do? The agent remained calm. We've got emails, phone records, and testimonies from former colleagues. You've been rigging cases for years, sending innocent people to prison in exchange for money and favors. You're done, Carter. The courtroom was in uproar. Gasps echoed as the agents laid out the evidence. The truth was spilling out, undeniable, like a flood too powerful to stop. But as Carter's world crumbled, Jamal's wasn't over. He had known all along that something bigger was at play. He had known that the system was too far gone, and he had been playing his part in a much larger plan. Jamal wasn't the man they thought he was. He was the one who had been watching them all along, quietly gathering intelligence, waiting for the moment when the truth would rise to the surface. And now, with Carter's unraveling, that moment had come. Jamal had always known that this trial wasn't about proving his innocence. It was about exposing a system of lies, corruption, and manipulation that had ruined too many lives. The truth was coming, and there was no stopping it now. In the holding cell, Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation wash over him. But it wasn't defeat he felt. It was focus, determination. He had prepared for this. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for justice, for every person who had ever been wronged by a system built on lies. The clock was ticking. The battle was far from over, and Jamal Hayes was no longer just a pawn in this game. He was its master. The room was tense, the air thick with uncertainty, as the FBI agents continued to present their evidence. But amidst the shock and chaos unfolding, no one noticed the quiet presence in the back of the courtroom. Jamal, still in his holding cell, was about to become the key to it all. The world outside might have thought him just another victim in a broken system, but he had known something that no one else did. The time to reveal his true identity was now. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, Jamal's eyes locked onto the only thing that mattered, the truth. He knew that for the system to truly change, for Carter and everyone involved to be brought down, the moment had to come when the final card was played. He had been playing this game all along, keeping his true identity hidden, even as they tried to destroy him. With a sudden motion, Jamal's voice rang out from behind the walls of the holding cell, sharp and clear, cutting through the noise. You think you have all the evidence, but you don't have the whole picture. Everyone stopped. The agents froze, their eyes widening in surprise. The courtroom grew quiet, uncertain of what was happening. Jamal's voice echoed louder now. You think Carter's the only one guilty here? You think this is just about one crooked judge? His words hung in the air, filled with gravity. Then, the door to the holding cell opened. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal walked into the courtroom, still in his prison jumpsuit, but his eyes were no longer those of a man condemned. They were the eyes of someone who had been playing a far greater game than anyone realized. The agent who had first confronted Carter looked at him, confusion filling her face. "What is this?" she asked, as Jamal stepped into the middle of the room. Jamal didn't answer her question immediately. He turned to face Carter, who was still standing in stunned silence. The once proud judge, now exposed, seemed smaller, his arrogance faltering under Jamal's gaze. "You should have known better than to mess with me, Carter," Jamal said, his voice low but filled with a quiet power. "You don't even realize who I am, do you?" The room held its breath as Jamal reached into the pocket of his jumpsuit, pulling out a small folded ID card. As he unfolded it, the FBI logo shone through clearly for everyone to see. The crowd gasped. "Jamal Hayes is not the man you think he is," he said calmly. "I'm an undercover agent, and this whole time, I've been gathering evidence on you, on your entire operation. The murder of Michael Williams? It was never about me. It was about getting me into your web, into your corrupt little system. And now I've got everything." The shock in the room was palpable. Carter's face drained of color as the truth hit him like a freight train. The smugness, the power, the control, it all crumbled in an instant. Jamal didn't stop there. "I'm not just here to expose Carter. I'm here to make sure that everything you've done, every innocent life you've ruined, every person you've sent to prison for no reason, comes to light." He turned to face the rest of the room. "I didn't just play the part of an innocent man. I played the part of a man with no voice, because that's the only way to make sure someone listens when the time is right." Monica, who had been standing silently in the back of the room, her hand on her mouth in disbelief, stepped forward. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were powerful. "Jamal, I had no idea. I had no idea. You've been working for the FBI this whole time?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Yes. I've been undercover for months, investigating this town, this court, and Carter. I knew it would come to this. But I had to be patient. I had to let them think they were winning. Because sometimes, the only way to take down a system is to make it implode on its own." The room remained silent, each person in shock over the revelation. The people who had once believed they knew Jamal, his friends, his family, the courtroom observers, were now seeing him in a completely new light. He wasn't a victim. He was the one who had been in control all along. And Carter? He was lost, trapped in the very game he thought he could manipulate. His mouth moved, but no words came out. The look in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and fear, told everyone that he realized his empire of lies was crumbling faster than he could comprehend. Jamal stood tall, the weight of the moment settling into the room. The tables had turned. The judge who had thought he could imprison a man for life had just sealed his own fate. The truth had finally come to light, and no amount of power or corruption could hide it anymore. And as the agents moved in to arrest Carter, Jamal didn't look back. He had done what he came to do, and now it was time for justice to take its rightful place. The courtroom was still in shock as the FBI agents surrounded Judge Carter, securing him with handcuffs. The weight of Jamal's revelation hung in the air, thick with the scent of justice finally being served. Carter's once proud, arrogant demeanor had melted away. He now stood there, trembling, as the truth crushed him under its weight. Jamal remained standing tall, his posture strong and unyielding. His eyes never left Carter's, but there was no hate in them, no anger, just cold, unrelenting clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about showing the world that power and corruption could only last so long before the people they trampled on stood up. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some people still processing the truth of Jamal's identity. They had seen him as just another victim of a broken system, but they hadn't known the real story. They hadn't known he was playing the game all along. using his position as a pawn to expose the corruption that lay beneath the surface. Monica, who had stood there with her mouth agape, slowly made her way to Jamal, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. She took his hand, squeezing it gently, as if needing to make sure he was truly there, that all of this was real. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I thought I knew you, Jamal. But this is something else." Jamal smiled softly, his gaze never leaving Carter. "Sometimes, the truth is the hardest thing to understand, Monica. But I couldn't risk them knowing who I was. Not yet." He squeezed her hand back. "I had to make them believe I was just like everyone else. I had to play my part, or this wouldn't have worked." The agent who had first confronted Carter stepped forward, nodding toward Jamal. "You did more than your duty, Hayes. You exposed an entire network of corruption, not just in this town, but beyond. What you did here today." Her voice trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's going to change everything." Jamal nodded quietly, but he didn't need her praise. The job wasn't finished yet. The true weight of what had just happened was still sinking in, but there was no time to relax. The battle for justice was never a singular victory. It was a process, a series of steps that needed to be taken until the system was changed for good. As Carter was escorted out of the courtroom, his head hanging low, Jamal turned his attention back to the room. He could hear the faint hum of whispers and the occasional gasp of realization as people started to understand just how deep the corruption ran. But Jamal's job was far from over. The case against Carter was just one piece of the puzzle. There were many more involved, many more who had used their power to ruin lives, and Jamal wasn't done hunting them down. He turned to Monica, pulling her close. "We've got a lot of work to do, but now that they see who I really am, I can do more than just fight for myself. I can make sure this never happens to anyone else." Monica nodded, the weight of what had just happened starting to make sense. Her husband had been playing a dangerous game, but he had done it for a reason. For justice. For truth. As Jamal and Monica walked out of the courtroom, their son running up to greet them, the world outside felt different. It felt lighter, as if the heavy hand of injustice had been momentarily lifted. The story of Jamal Hayes was no longer just about one man, wrongly convicted. It was about the fight for justice, the fight against a system that allowed power to go unchecked. And Jamal wasn't going to stop until he had exposed it all. The truth had been revealed. And now, it was time for the world to change. As Jamal stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The courtroom doors had closed behind him, but the fight was far from over. Carter had been just one link in a much larger chain of corruption. The system he had worked so hard to expose was only the beginning of what needed to be torn down. And Jamal Hayes, he was just getting started. Walking down the courthouse steps, Jamal felt the eyes of the world on him. He had taken down a judge, a symbol of the broken system, but there were still many more to be held accountable. The work he had done had only scratched the surface. There was more to uncover, more lies to expose, more people to bring to justice. The fight for truth was a marathon, not a sprint, and Jamal knew it would take time, effort, and unwavering determination. Monica, by his side, looked up at him with pride. Their son ran ahead, the weight of their future no longer so heavy. For the first time in a long time, the world felt a little less broken. But Jamal wasn't done yet. "We've come this far, but it's only the beginning," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been wronged by a system built to keep them down. We're going to make sure they hear our voices now." And so, with the sun shining down on them, the Hayes family walked forward, knowing their battle wasn't over. But they also knew that they had just shifted the balance. Jamal wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for justice, for the truth, for everyone who had been silenced, forgotten, and left behind. As the camera faded out, the message was clear. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep the lies go. It might take time, it might take patience, but in the end, justice will prevail. What do you think of Jamal's journey? Do you think the system can ever truly change, or is it always stacked against the people? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to share this story with others who need to hear it. If you want to stay updated on stories like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there's so much more to uncover, and we want you to be part of this journey.